The elevator shuddered. Fluorescent lights threw a hard, sickly strobe across the stainless steel walls. Emergency bulbs hummed. Jack Rowan's gloved hand was on the panel, fingers flattened against the cool metal, listening to the building breathe and click above them. Claire Voss was on the phone, voice clipped, a command in sentences that had never once been softened. The doors slowed, a thin sigh of cable and pulley, and then the world pitched. If you'll stay until the end of this story, you'll see why a single fight for truth can tilt a company back toward its promise. Like the video, subscribe for more stories about integrity that don't let power cover things up. The elevator dropped a foot and then another, a stomach fall without the end. For a second, everything felt weightless. Claire's phone hit the floor with a small clatter. Her polished shoes slid against the polished plate, and Jack's breath caught. He smelled oil and copper and the faint sweetness of someone else's pressed suit. Emma's backpack, the faded dinosaur patch on its strap, thumped against the corner as the lights went from flicker to red emergency glow. Outside, distant alarms began a slow wail. "Stay still," Jack said. His voice was low. He had learned to keep his edges blunt since the night they had dragged him out of his position, when his clearance badge had been revoked and his name became a rumor. "Hold on to the rail. Don't brace your feet against the doors." Claire's eyes found him for a beat, not really seeing him, or maybe seeing a man she'd once signed away a livelihood of. She nodded, fingers white on the phone she couldn't feel. The elevator juddered again with the tiny sound of something giving. The lights went to an even thinner halo as the emergency backup took over. There was a drop that felt like a cliff. Jack's knuckles scraped the panel as his body reacted the way it always had when machinery betrayed him. He was, at one time, the company's lead in data security. He had built systems to trust, and then the systems had been turned on their creators. A whisper of static, then heat, a smell that made Jack's nostrils flare. Something in the control box had shorted. The cables shivered. A thin wire seared and snapped. The elevator lurched and stopped, as if someone had thrown a handbrake. For a moment, they hung between floors, like a secret in a room no one else could enter. Claire's voice broke then, the first crack in armor he had watched from the lobby when she finally took the chief executive's chair 3 years prior. "Is anyone—" She swallowed, steadying. "Can you get us out?" "I can get us to the floor," Jack said, "but we'll need the maintenance hatch. There's a service ladder. 2 people can climb up and wedge the door." She laughed then, a short sound that wasn't humor. "I've been in this building my whole life," she said, "never once crawled through a hatch." "Then it's time," Jack replied. They climbed in uneven rhythm. Emma's feet were small and quick. She clung to Jack's back as he hoisted the emergency ladder and pushed up through the gap where light leaked from the shaft like a wound. The metallic tang of the service shaft filled Claire's nose, the smear of old grease and concrete dust turning her skin briefly gray. For the first time in public memory, she moved without her team around her, without the buffer of legal counsel and PR staff that cleared the world for her. They reached the top by muscle and breath. Jack's hand slipped. He cursed under his breath and pressed his palm to the grate. Claire's shoulder hit the metal as she scrambled over him, and for a beat her face was inches from his, eyes wide in the halo of a maintenance light. Up close, she looked younger than the world expected, and the tightness at the corners of her mouth made something raw and honest there. Not weakness, but the moment before someone decides whether to be who they've been or who they could be. When they crawled out into the corridor, the building was a chorus of alarms and distant voices. Security guards hustled like wood ants, radios buzzing. The lobby was a storm of staff and the press, the glow of emergency exit signs painting the marble in strips. Claire's shoes left a streak as she pushed for the stairwell, and Jack followed with Emma tucked beneath his arm. He felt her presence like ballast. The child was everything that had kept him awake the night his career had been taken, everything that had made him crawl back into the building as a maintenance man, where no one would notice the angle of his shoulders when he bent under a console, where his uniform worked like a costume to hide old scars. They stopped at the maintenance closet under the third-floor stair, where the building's diagnostic panel sat like a small shrine. Jack had chosen the place when he took this job. It let him be invisible, but it put him close to the bones of the company. He had brought something else with him the night he started, a USB drive taped inside the handle of his toolbox. It was small and dull, the color of neglected secrets. It had been his plan to plant a single, undeniable record of transactions that should never have happened. He had found them buried in logs. He had made copies. He had wrapped them in a tiny, cold container and kept it on a chain around his wrist, like an amulet you only touch when you have to remember. Claire watched him at the panel, not commanding, simply present, and something like guilt, not theatrical, not flitting, passed across her face. "What are you doing, Jack?" she asked. "Diagnostics," he said. "I need to check the emergency feed. If we can pull logs from a local readout, maybe get you what you need to see the—" He didn't finish the word. The memory of being hauled before the board, the polite indifference of her father's old shadow, the signed orders that turned him into a scapegoat, all lined him up like pictures on a wall he had to look at. She stepped closer. "Show me." He handed her the USB on the chain. Her fingers were cool as she took it, thumb brushing the tiny ridged side. For a second she hesitated, like someone who has been told how to sign something for years and suddenly realizes the pen might write something they did not want to make permanent. He watched her as she found the diagnostic port behind the panel and slid the drive in. The screen flickered. Files began to unfurl. Transaction trails, wire movements, time-stamped emails with headers and routing logs. There it was, a map of money flowing through a maze. At the top of the trail, his chest tightened as her name appeared, not as the originator, but as the stamp that made everything legally queen, a digital signature that, on paper, would link her to the transfers in a way she could not remove without implication. Claire leaned back, breath leaving like steam. "This can't be right," she said. "It's the system," Jack said, the low certainty in his voice born of nights spent tracing code like footprints. "They buried it under shell accounts and then pushed it through signature verification. Whoever had access to the keys could stamp anything." Claire's hands shook as she scrolled. "My father, he wouldn't." Her voice failed on the edge of the word. "You know corporate families," Jack said. "You grew up in these rooms. You know how the ledger can be handwritten and then rewritten." She set the laptop on the floor, then, by habit perhaps, touched the logo on her cuff, as if the company's crest might hold an answer. "We have to bring it to the board," she said. "We have to—" The building had other plans. In the dim hum, the diagnostic panel spit a thin electric hiss. The emergency lighting stuttered. A smell of ozone climbed like a warning. The USB sparked where it touched the port. Claire yelped and jerked it free, but the drive had already gone dark, its tiny casing a melted, useless thing. A thin black thread of plastic clung to the port like a burned tongue. Jack watched it fall into his palm and burn his skin with a curiosity that was more shock than pain. "They fry anything that touches critical ports these days," he muttered, rubbing the sore. He had known the building had sensors, the company liked its defenses, but he had not expected a countermeasure that would destroy the one thing he had wrapped in months of patience. "Do you have any other copies?" Claire asked, voice sharper now, surgeon precise. He did not. He had made the USB because he trusted that a physical object could be hidden. He had not trusted the network that betrayed him. For a flash of a second, anger slid under his skin, not at Claire, but at the system that preferred the sanctity of money to the dignity of people. He imagined his daughter, Emma, and the nights he had sat with her while she fell asleep, whispering stories about the kind of world he wanted her to inherit. The drive in his palm was gone. The proof he had grown into hope was ash. Claire sat down hard against the maintenance door, back to concrete, and looked at him not with corporate calculation, but with something raw, vulnerability. "They've been using my account," she said slowly. "Someone stamped transactions with my signature. If they've got a way to burn evidence that touches this hardware, then they've been covering their tracks." "Then we find the trail where it began," Jack said. "Signatures leave traces. The servers log keys, timestamps, the IPs. If the signature is fraudulent, there are still keys stored somewhere. If we can get into the legal archive or the CFO's office, I can pull forensic snaps." Claire drew a long breath and stood. Whatever fear had been there was doused by a steel-made decision. "I'll lock the boardroom," she said. "I'll call in a meeting. I'll demand the internal audit. I'll—" Her voice cracked, and he saw her falter between the impulse to protect a legacy and the need to correct a wrong. She did not call the legal counsel first. She did not hide behind a committee. She walked, pale and determined, into the glass-topped shaft of leadership where the board would convene. On her way, she passed a portrait of her father, eyes carved into a reputation, and something in her jaw set. For the first time since the company had named her successor, she felt the twin currents of loyalty and revulsion pull at her. She chose the revulsion toward deceit. The boardroom had the polished cold of rooms that decide other people's lives. Members shifted in their chairs, mouths practiced into lines. The CFO's face was the color of toast. The lead counsel's fingers folded as if they had done this many times. Claire closed the door, and the room hummed like a sealed engine. "I found something," she said. She was crisp. The board waited, their assumption of control like sediment that had settled over years. Jack watched as she pushed the laptop across the table. "This was in a diagnostic feed," she said. "It was destroyed, but I saw the transactions. They implicate transfers and accounts leading to irregular disbursements." The CFO's eyebrows rose. "Are you alleging fraud?" he asked, his voice the practiced tilt of a man who managed numbers the way some men tended gardens. "I'm alleging we audit immediately," Claire replied. She had a voice now that was both her father's and not. "I will not have this company fall into the hands of old arrangements that use my name for cover." "You're speaking of your father," the lead counsel said. "This is delicate. If we wait," Claire interrupted, "they'll clean the logs. If we wait, the trail will vanish." "I want transparency. I want this company known for integrity, not for how loyalties hide crime." There was a murmur, and an old guard voice, thin like cotton pulled tight, rose. "You would throw family to the wolves." Claire's reply was a small, dangerous thing. "I would rather face wolves with the truth than live with foxes who eat us from the inside." The room held its breath. Loyalty bent towards ancient alliances. The board's instinct was to consolidate, to bury scandal. But Claire held her ground. The board saw a CEO who had been raised in the family firm, and a daughter who could equally choose to preserve or to purge. Some of them shifted uneasily. The CFO, who had the power to delay, did not move to stop her. Some old habits are confident but not invincible. Within 12 hours, forensic teams were in the data center. Federal agents listened. A subpoena burned like white light through legal hands. The company's internal logs, which had been carefully massaged to appear pristine, yielded their fingerprints once investigators knew where to look. The trail that had been intended to sink Jack's credibility led back, like a tracked animal, to a series of shell accounts and email headers with a signature key that had been issued under the father's old administration and used to stamp anything with corporate authority. That key, it turned out, had been misappropriated and used in ways that enriched shell companies owned by board associates. Publicly, the company issued a statement about an internal review. The press smelled blood. The first headlines were cold and eager. Jack kept to his work, hands rough with the smell of oil and the dust of vents. He watched as cameras parked across the street like curious crows. When rumors dipped towards his name, Claire's office called and asked for him to come up. She met him in the same room where she had closed the board meeting, a small glass sanctum above the city. "You could have walked out," she told him. He leaned against the window and watched the city move below. "Walked out to where? My daughter needs me. I don't have a parachute made of money. I have a toolbox and an honest day's sweat." "You didn't have to come back," she said. "Why did you?" He thought of Emma, of the way her hands curled under his chin when she slept, of the notes he left in her lunchbox to make the day feel less sharp. Because someone has to be stubborn enough to go into the noise and find the shape of truth. They talked in frankness then, as if excising a tumor. Claire confessed late-night meetings she had sat through where figures moved like chess pieces on checked paper. She said the word "my father" less like an accusation and more like an illness she had been born into. He told her what it had been like to be fired, to sign papers that said he had violated policy, to have his security clearance stripped and his name put in the paper as an example. He told her about the hollow nights when the rent was late and the way his daughter's eyes had asked for certainty from a man who had none to give. "You trusted them," Claire said finally. I thought the people who built this place would protect it. I thought my name would mean something." "It does," Jack said. "You can let it mean what they wrote it to be, or you can let it mean what you decide." There was a long pause. Claire's hands were folded so tightly her knuckles paled. Then she pushed them open and reached for something that had not been hers to touch: responsibility. They engineered a plan that was surgical and messy both. Claire used her access to initiate a live trace and demanded that all external connections be logged and preserved while the forensics team worked. She ordered the company to lock down the CFO's accounts pending investigation. The board squirmed. Some resisted. The old guard fought to erase risk. But Claire had more than a title now. She had seen the burned plastic of the USB in Jack's hand and the look of a man for whom livelihood had been a lamb. The media convened as the investigators prepared their report. Claire and Jack stood, awkward partners on a stage that no one had planned. When the press conference opened, Claire read a statement with a voice tempered by contrition and clarity. She spoke of failures in oversight, of a breach in ethics, of a commitment to restitution. She named the father's legacy and dismantled it in public, not to destroy him, but to tear out the rot that had been allowed to grow unchecked. She called for active changes, transparency in signing keys, oversight committees that included outside members, restitution funds directed to affected parties. There were arrests. The lead counsel, the CFO, and a handful of board members were escorted from the building in the public eye. The SEC and federal agents filed their motions, and subpoenas became the architecture of consequence. The company's stock wobbled but steadied under the promise of a new guard and a public accounting. There were restitution talks that took months. Settlements, payouts, a foundation established to return funds to clients harmed by the misdirection. Jack watched as men who had once had the power to sign his career away found themselves led by men in plain clothes. It was not immediate justice, and it was not clean. There were negotiations and legal complexities that would take years to fully unravel. But the public moment had swung the arc. Claire made good on her promise. She authorized an internal review, and, against the advice of some of her remaining allies, she opened the company to an external audit and announced 20 policies that would change the company's governance. When the dust settled, measured not by absence of noise, but by a new kind of quiet where accountability hummed like a new machine, the company issued reparations. A fund was set up, and, in a ceremony that felt more sober than triumphant, the executives invited community leaders, clients, and a small group of employees who had been hurt by the misdeeds. Jack was there in a simple shirt and a jacket he had been given by a colleague, and Emma, now a little older and holding a drawing of a rocket, stood with him. Claire walked up the stage with a folder that had the names of the policies inside and a hand extended that was, by then, no longer just for optics. "Your fight mattered," she said to Jack when they stood side by side before the crowd. "You didn't let them bury what you knew." He could have said, "I told you," but that would have been petty and useless in a room trying to stitch itself back together. Instead, he took the microphone and said what came out of the long months of his life like water finally finding the shape of its bed. "No single person is clean in this," he said. "But a company, a community, can choose to be better if it looks at what it has harmed and tries to fix it. Integrity doesn't happen without stubbornness." Afterward, Claire offered him a position he had not expected. Not the old title, not the small consolation of a job that paid lip service to ethics. She offered him leadership over a newly formed Office of Security and Ethics, a place with teeth and budgets and independent oversight. He hesitated because the temptation to refuse was real, to look back and say he had been burned enough. But Emma's hand closed around him, and the memory of nights without steady pay made him realize that the fight was better offered as a vocation than as a wound. "You sure?" Claire asked as she slid the offer across the table after the ceremony, her face lit by the stage lights and the long, honest gaze of someone who had chosen to be accountable. He looked at the piece of paper and then at her. "Only if you mean it," he said. She smiled, a tired, sincere thing. "I mean it." They rebuilt systems. They designed policies so that a signature could not be stamped without multi-party verification. They installed background checks and rotating keys. They invited external auditors to review the firm every quarter. It was bureaucratic work, the kind that tasted of coffee and long meetings, but it also tasted like recovery. The elevator that had once been the place of terror now ran smooth. They had its cables checked. The maintenance team that once had been a hidden caste became part of a new committee that met publicly.
Emma grew, as children do, into a quieter version of the storm she had been. Her backpack lost the dinosaur patch and gained the insignia of a school she loved. She started to see the man she called Dad not as the damaged thing the tabloids had described, but as someone who had clawed back a story. Claire came to PTA meetings sometimes, not as a public figure, but as a parent who had learned how quickly the apparatus of institutions could corrupt what was noble. They found a symmetry in their lives. One had been cast out by a system he had tried to defend. The other had inherited a system that had betrayed her trust. They met in the middle, not as equals in power, but as accomplices in repair. There was a day, months later, when they stood in the elevator again, but this time there was no flicker of red. The lights were steady, the hum even, and the city skyline spread outside the mirrored surface like a promise. Claire's hand brushed the rail. Jack's thumb found the chain he had once held in clutch. They neither spoke nor reached for dramatic gestures. The elevator rose, and they rose with it. On the night before Emma's 13th birthday, Jack sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling in his hands. The house smelled of sugar and crayons and the faint grease of a day's work. He thought of the months of grief and the slower, patient months of rebuilding. He thought of Claire in her office, sometimes late, sometimes older when she walked into the room. He thought of what integrity had cost them: sleepless nights, reputations, the blunt sting of betrayal, and what it had returned: trust, a job with meaningful work, and a new policy that would protect others from the quiet kind of theft that had taken his life apart. Later, he would stand at a small ceremony where the company hung a plaque in the lobby, a list of names who had worked to make sure such a thing would not happen again. He would read his name and the title and feel something settle. But for now he rested, the house hum a litany of ordinary life, and thought of the small things. He picked up a scrap of paper Emma had tucked under a cup, a drawing of a rocket with two figures holding hands, and he smiled. When he looked out the window at the city lights, he thought of the elevator again, and all the places people are trapped, not by cables, but by the inertia of institutions that prefer the quiet of concealment to the noise of truth. He had been trapped once. He had pulled himself out. People would still make mistakes. People would still choose wrong. But he had seen with his own two eyes how a person could choose different when given the choice. He cleared his throat and finally let the voiceover that would accompany this chapter of his life be simple and direct, like the way he had learned to speak since the fall. You have to go down sometimes to find what's been hidden, and when you find it, you dig it up and you bring it into the light. The last line came with no triumphalism, only the quiet steadiness of someone who had been broken and chosen to mend. The company had paid restitution, the board had been reshaped, and policies were now a living process rather than a ledger of excuses. Claire continued to lead, scarred but wiser, shaping the firm into something that could hold more than its founders' ambitions.